Hello, and welcome to A New Way Forward, Reimagining the Nonprofit Workplace Virtual Engagement Series, presented by Council of Michigan Foundations, Michigan Nonprofit Association, Michigan Community Resources, and COAC Detroit. This engaging and interactive multi-part series is designed to provide guidance to nonprofits throughout Michigan as you consider re-entry into the workplace. Sessions are grounded in equity and designed to balance the exploration of legal, HR, and financial requirements, as well as ways to strengthen team culture, redefine the workspace, and realign the mission. Today's topic is about advocacy, civic engagement, and supporting social movements as 501c3 organizations. I am Kelly Kuhn, Vice President of Michigan Nonprofit Association, and I will serve as your host. Before we begin, we want to express our appreciation to anyone returning from our past sessions, as well as extend a warm welcome to those joining us for the first time. For those who are joining for the first time, our past sessions have been filled with a variety of content and robust conversations, from legal and HR considerations for safely returning to the workplace, to design solutions for reentry, leveraging technology, board best practices, and planning for your financial future. The slides and webinar recordings of all these past sessions are available on each of the presenting organizations' websites. We have another great session planned today and are excited to hear from our presenters, who will discuss how we can effectively advocate for those we serve and go deeper in our engagement of social movements that support an anti-racist and equity-centered new way forward. In this interactive session, we will explore several opportunities to advance this critical work that are centered in social justice, advocacy, and civic engagement, while also balancing legal considerations and maintaining our 501c3 status. A few housekeeping before we begin. This webinar is being recorded. The recording and slides will be shared afterward. As you know, the information around COVID-19 is moving at a rapid pace, and the situation is ever changing. We are all doing our best to understand and apply what we can. This context is important to express as we begin today, as our presenters plan to share guidance, which should not be construed as legal or financial advice. We have built in time for your questions and answers after the presenters complete their content. All participants are muted, so please use the chat function to ask your questions. Not only do we want you to use the chat function for your questions, we also encourage you to follow it throughout the presentation for helpful tips and links. When the session concludes, we invite you to stay on and join us in the lobby. The lobby is where you can share and connect more informally with other participants. We will not have any formal programming, but rather just give some time and space to make connections. Please consider standing by at the end to be placed in the lobby. We have the last session in our series scheduled for next week. In this session, we will explore the ways we can work within our organizations and collectively to reset the structures and policies that have held us back from a truly equitable future. All four of the CEOs of the sponsoring organizations of this series will be back to engage in this conversation, and we invite you to join us. Please consider registering through the link provided on the slide now. Now on to today's presentation. We are grateful and excited to be joined by some nonprofit leaders and an attorney who are doing some great work and are knowledgeable in the area. To help keep us on track, I'd like to introduce Janae Gilmore, who is a friend and colleague and serves as our moderator for today's session. Janae is a senior program manager at Michigan Community Resources. In her role, she facilitates nonprofit collaboratives, strengthening their ability to tackle big issues, from increasing access to capital for women and minority-owned business owners to challenging social and racial inequity in the nonprofit ecosystem. Please join me in welcoming Janae.
Hello, sorry about that. Once again, my name is Janae Gilmore, and it is my great pleasure to be able to introduce our panelists for today. So our first speaker is going to be Shalana Lewis. Shalana is the Community Investment Officer for Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation at the Kalamazoo Community Foundation, where she has established and leads the community collaborative aimed at changing culture and systems to end racism. She is passionate about cultivating relationships and partnerships to create social change in a way that supports grassroots and community-based leaders and understands that holding space for healing is critical to this work. After Shalana, we will be hearing from Nellie Tsai. Nellie serves as M&A's Community and Civic Engagement Director, focusing on initiatives that activate citizen leadership in communities across Michigan. Her favorite part of her job, she says, is meeting and interacting with so many people who are working to make Michigan more inclusive and equitable across various issue areas. And then finally, wrapping up our presentations, we'll be hearing from Leo Gadeen, a senior attorney of Miller Canfield, Paddock & Stone. Leo handles all areas of general corporate and commercial law. In particular, he specializes in counseling nonprofits and charitable organizations. Leo enjoys working with nonprofits because they are focused on a bigger cause, which usually involves helping others and the greater community. Leo has also spent his legal career deeply committed to providing quality pro bono services to nonprofits, and he has received many honors and awards for this service, as well as the deep gratitude of countless nonprofit organizations. And with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Shalana. Thank you.
Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm really excited to present first and talk a little bit about the Truth, Racial Healing Transformation work happening in Kalamazoo. If you don't mind advancing. So the Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation work really started under Kellogg's leadership 2016, where they worked with over 170 partners across the country to develop a model for community and national social change. It was really similar in the thought process of what we know of as TRCs, Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, but designed a little differently with some acknowledgement of what is the relationship of people of color to this country, and it's a little different than in others. And so they really wanted to think about something that would be completely transformative, both on the cultural level and a systems change level. So this is a model and a framework that over 14 cities across the country are working on, cities and locations. And we happen to have 4 of those here in Michigan, and I'm one. Lansing, Flint, and Battle Creek are also doing this work. So we're really excited to be in our, just closing our 3rd year, so entering into our 4th year of operations in Kalamazoo. Okay, next slide. This is the model that we follow for the TRHT, and it really is inspiring to think about how to connect the dots between so many different types of social change work that we know of. I think as a nonprofit, usually you would work on either one sector, one system, a service delivery, or you might work on cultural issues, narrative change issues, but it's hard to think about all at one, and that's why this model is so unique. I'm housed at the Kalamazoo Community Foundation, so I continuously think about these things because we're a part of the grant making team. And it's a really unique perspective to be within a foundation doing this programmatic work in a different type of relationships to grantees and other community leaders. And really what the model is having a local coalition, which should include all kinds of different sectors, business sector, nonprofit, government, grassroots leaders, youth, faith-based, and everyone in between who's dedicated to jettisoning the hierarchy of human value. And our core tenets are really centering truth and healing first. And that's kind of the hardest part, is really thinking about what does that mean to lead with truth and healing, and then start to do the transformative work of thinking about our legal system, our economic system, separation, which is a concept that includes both housing and education and health and all the ways that we're separate. And we also, in some contexts, think deeply about colonization here. Next slide. At our core, what we're working to do is to address the hierarchy of human value that sustains racism. And what we really think about when you think about racism and you think about all the other isms and think about equity, what is the root cause of that? And a lot of the root cause of the issues we face is that in our society, we have this hierarchy of human value that really has been embedded across our systems and has caused tons of issues, generational issues, trauma, and that we really need to start to value each other and value each other's humanity as a first step towards healing and change. So thank you. I do believe we have a poll. If that can go up, I had a poll question. Okay, so I was just curious of everybody here who has done from their organization have a really intentional, explicit organizational strategy that includes either racial equity or racial justice, diversity, equity, inclusion. Yes or no, just a quick poll of who has this explicitly out there in their mission, in their strategy, in their strategic plan of the organization that they work with right now. So quick question. And then I have a second question, I think we can, oh wow, okay, so close to half, great, that's so great. I know this work is so hard, and I know for us at the Community Foundation, our work on DEI really started quite a long time ago. And so one of the things that I always lift up is that with our TRHT work and doing this deep systems change work, we really didn't start with that. We really started with diversity, equity, inclusion trainings and things of that nature, because it really created a foundation to make the changes necessary, hiring changes, internal policy practice changes. And we're ongoing doing that type of work still at the Community Foundation. However, we see this TRHT work as A, meeting that foundation to really get started, and then B, also just actually doing that work out in community means that we are also continuing to push ourselves to grow in that direction. So thank you. And then I have a second poll question. How many of you work directly with grassroots organizers, community advocates, and I would say small grassroots nonprofits in partnership, and really work with them directly to either create strategy or implement programs? So really quick, if folks can answer that question. Okay, and then we can go to the next slide while folks are responding, I think. Awesome, okay, yep, great. 68% said yes. That's really great. So I asked those questions because when we really started working on TRHT, one of the first projects that we got started on was housing. There was a dire need to address housing issues in Kalamazoo, and you can see that issue just across the country in general. But we have some of the highest numbers of youth homelessness in Kalamazoo across the state, and some other issues that were just glaring and maybe beyond what other communities are facing. So one of our earliest projects was a partnership, and partnerships are really, really challenging when you're working across sectors. And this was such a beautiful partnership and continues to be. So we have two government entities that were involved: Kalamazoo City government, the Department of Civil Rights, our Community Foundation, and then two nonprofits, Isaac being an organizing and advocacy nonprofit, in the Fair Housing Center. And then we actually also had several other community advocates who joined Isaac, but started off as individual community housing advocates who kind of joined into the project. This was an early one funded by an innovation grant from the Local and Regional Government Alliance on Race and Equity. So that acronym is GARE. It's a national org, really great resource for local governments. So that was our partnership. Next slide. And what we did was we really wanted to center around how do you, all of these organizations really get on the same page about what the issues are and what the strategy should be to address them in a comprehensive way. And so we went about collecting survey data and analyzing available data for the city's HUD report. So usually cities do some sort of community engagement, but I don't know that there was a whole lot of examples, at least not in Kalamazoo, of the city government doing that community engagement in partnership with community organizations, where we're designing the engagement questions together, learning about the HUD process. We're also kind of analyzing the data together in a deep way. So that's really what we did. And because there was so many different people at the table, and because we ended up framing the questions differently, we really got past a lot of barriers of engagement fatigue and really got some truly honest feedback from community about one issue in particular, housing discrimination in Kalamazoo. And it was really, really telling that people did not know where to report. They did not trust the reporting process. But there was such this huge 56% of people of the, I believe it was 690 people we surveyed, said they had experienced housing discrimination or knew somebody that had. And that's just so heartbreaking to know. But that's what we found in our survey, knowing that most of the people lived right in our city, or at least in our county. So next slide. So as a result of that, and kind of in tandem, some of our community advocates that had been joining our data collection and really engaging with us had some ideas about the change they wanted to see happen. And our data really just spoke to the need that these community organizers had already been talking about of, hey, you know, this is an issue, people cannot get housing. And so as a result, many of us got behind an advocacy effort kind of in tandem again with the data collection and analysis to go ahead and make the change immediately, because we recognize that our community activists are going to be ahead of us. They don't need to analyze the data. They know exactly what's going on. And so let's jump on, let's get on board. We have some data that shows us that this is really important, and we can use that to communicate. But what we really need to do is start listening to community and really just follow the lead, because folks are not putting in time and energy for free as advocates for no reason. There's a reason why they're calling these issues out. And so what we ended up with is a housing equity ordinance. What it does is set up a civil rights board, which it actually just passed this past September 8th. So we're really excited. We worked on this for about 2 years. For me and some other of our community advocates are actually working on it for more than that. So really excited. Many communities in Michigan have these protections already, but we did not. And so we have a application for a civil rights board up and ready to go. And the idea is that we need to protect our community against disparate impact forms of discrimination. So, you know, we know that disproportionately the source of income, for example, housing vouchers, it's mainly Black community members who have housing vouchers in our community. So when you have a ton of landlords saying we don't accept vouchers, that's disparate impact in terms of housing discrimination. So we made a case for we need to stop people from being able to make blanket statements about ID methods. So we have a county ID, and that's accessible to folks with different statuses, maybe folks who can't get their license from the Secretary of State because they owe money. Well, they still need housing and they still need an ID to get housing, right? So we have this county ID, but we absolutely needed to make sure that folks are accepting it and using it. So things of that nature. So we really worked hard and really excited and just super proud. Our now Vice Mayor is championing this, and we're looking at other communities having this really impactful policy change. Next slide. So some of the lessons learned and practices I just wanted to share with you all through that example, and what some of the challenges were, because over 2.5, maybe close to 3 years, working in deep partnership with advocates and government and philanthropy and nonprofits, it definitely had some challenges. And you can see some pictures of us, that's our data collection at the bottom. Some of us getting an award at a banquet because of this work. we have to, some of the challenges we really needed to face were recognizing what opposition is out there and what bias is impacting both our organizations and our community when we go for social change and pushing for social change. Sometimes it's subtle, especially in a smaller town or a culture that isn't necessarily direct, and there's relationships that folks want to protect. Many times this type of thing is really subtle, but we have to really be clear on what the opposition is and will be, and how bias plays out even in our own organizations when we are thinking about this type of change work. Obviously, in the middle of this, COVID happened and there's tons of civil unrest. And what we recognized is through this process, because we had worked so hard on it and we knew that these were issues, the COVID and the civil unrest this summer and the issue with COVID-19 really just kind of catapulted us, because we knew that these were issues already. Because of those two things, it felt like the whole world knew and understood the issues and knew that the issues were going to even get worse. So we knew that not only did COVID-19 make our work even more urgent, the civil unrest made it more obvious to more people that something needs to be done about it. But I found with this equity work in general, this moment has validated and created new opportunities so much, because people are much more willing to do change work now. And we knew that these problems also did exist before. Obviously, I know we'll talk later in this webinar about how to fund this type of work. And so looking and making sure that we're appropriately categorizing different funding sources and know what we can use for this type of work is really important. And I touched on this a little bit before, but the idea that change happens from the inside out, we often as nonprofits think about change work as out in the community and don't always think about it as internal. And it really is a both and. We have to do that internal change work. We have to think about how we operate, our culture, our accessibility. What time do we have meetings? Does our technology, is that open access if we're partnering with community activists who don't have certain subscriptions? Do we think about what time our meeting, what location is our meeting, et cetera? And then we really have to think about also how the work will impact the whole organizational strategy, not just this one silo, right? And sometimes it's very uncomfortable because it brings out uncomfortable truths about, for example, who we're partnering with. One of the key things that we heard from our community engagement was just direct criticism of some housing provider, nonprofit housing providers in our community. And we have to sit back and receive that and say that is part of this process. If we're going to really do something about it, we have to allow and invite that type of feedback as well. It's not always out there. Sometimes it's internal to us. And just empowering staff and trusting staff as part of trusting community. Next slide. And then just the final thing I want to stress, and it's a core tenet of TRHT, obviously, and in the nonprofit sector, of course, relationships are so important, but how we approach them can be very, very different. And what we learned and what really helped strengthen and guide the partnership to last this long, because there was definitely tense points. We had this idea that we have to have transparency amongst partners. We have to co-create strategy. We cannot come in and we have to acknowledge that there's power. Some partners may have more power than others, more influence, more connections, more access to funding, more access to decision making. And we cannot let that dictate how we partner. We have to really open that up and be as collaborative as possible from an early stage. Be honest about what each organization needs and is what is on our agenda, but also think about a holistic picture of the community and keep that central. And as I said, oftentimes community leaders, grassroots leaders, they know about the issues far before the press does, far before the institutions do. They know exactly what's going on in the community. And so it became so clear that it took us sometimes as institutional leaders, and I mean that in the sense of the partnership, the time to do the data collection and the time to think about it, talk about it, when community leaders were already really calling this out. And so one of the best things that I would say is, you know, those community leaders that are always out there, always pushing for things, always calling things out, those are the folks you need to talk to and build a relationship with, because they're going to move fast and they're going to let you know exactly what it is. And if you trust them and if you work with them, you're going to have your change efforts work so much more smoothly, because they have relationships with community in a different way, and it's just going to help you move the work forward. And then just think about norms of partnerships. We use group agreements called touchstones, and we just continue to have norms of partnerships. And when things get tense, we oftentimes have a type of a healing circle type of a meeting where we really talk about what are some of the issues going on, and let's name them and let's try to work through them together and not just sweep them under the rug or allow them to disrupt the partnership. So that's all a part of trust building and shared decision making consistently. So with that, I'll turn it back over. Thank you so much. And I will be around for Q&A at the end.
Thanks so much, Shalana. You guys can advance to the next slide for me, please. Hi again, my name is Nellie Tsai, and I work at the Michigan Nonprofit Association. And I'm so glad I get to follow someone like Shalana, because I really feel like organizing and civic engagement have never been more intertwined than right now. And I feel like they go hand in hand in helping moments become movements. And chances are, if you're attending this webinar today, you already know that a functioning democracy, keyword functioning democracy, is critical to all of our livelihoods, to all of our community. Functioning democracy is critical, so critical to our nonprofit goals and civic missions. And M&A is deeply committed to helping nonprofits use civic and community engagement strategies to advance all of your missions. We know our work in our communities, they all depend on good government, fair representation. They depend on us to help lift up voices. Many of us serve and represent marginalized communities. When we participate fully in civic life, when we organize individuals for collective action, we are able to amplify these voices and concerns. We become loud enough to be seen and to be heard. And don't get me wrong, I know and am painfully aware there are systemic policies and practices put in place that actively work to disenfranchise us, that actively try to silence our voices. We know those too, and we live this every day. We know that there are frequent implicit, and explicit messages that aim to discourage and exclude certain voices, certain groups from civic participation, that your one census doesn't matter, that your singular vote doesn't matter, that these are parts of living in America that are closed to you, that you don't belong here based on your language that you speak, where you live, etc. And we also know from post-2016 election surveys that there is a widespread belief that the system is rigged. And yet we can all imagine something better, a society and a community where Black, Indigenous, and communities of colors are told that they are here, that they belong here, and you are actively encouraged to participate in civic life. Shalana's presentation is a great example of just how powerful this could be when you organize to change policies from the inside out. The first step towards equity is always understanding how power works and using it for change. So I'll be using my time today to talk through some of M&A's civic engagement initiatives and how we've worked through this. Next slide, please. Great. I'm sure, and I hope you're all aware that Census 2020 is here and is actually quickly approaching its end. And I wouldn't be doing my job as one of the leads for a nonprofit count campaign if I didn't ask, how many of you on the webinar today have actually filled out your census? I think I have a poll, really simple, yes or no, have you filled out your census? Could we get to that, please? I'll give it a second for the poll to appear.
Hey all, with this poll, if you put it in the Q&A, that's how we'll respond to this poll.
Okay,
Just
great.
type it
Thanks,
right.
Melissa. Great. So yes, just put it in the Q&A. We'd love to know if you filled out your census already. And thank you so much for those of you who have filled it out. It's really quick. The last of my slides will walk you through the website where you can go and fill it out for your household. And if you haven't, please do. The census is so important. Critical and crucial decisions are made based on data from the census, including how your schools, fire departments, and other public services in our communities are funded and how we're represented in the U.S. Congress. I think of the census as kind of the building block of American democracy, and that this constitutional mandate to count every person in the U.S., it shapes how we interact with each other and how our communities look and feel. It's kind of like the invisible thread, to get another metaphor going, that pulls our daily lives together. Our schools are built based on census data, where the traffic lights are in your community, where community centers open, local businesses, all of this relies on demographic data that the census provides. So imagine how resource rich your community could be if everyone was counted, that local governments and state governments and federal governments saw you and your neighbors, saw you and counted you. We know, and it's on your slide here, that in the 2010 census, the last time the full census was done, it missed a lot of historically undercounted populations. 2.1% of Black communities were undercounted. Nearly 2% of the Hispanic community was undercounted. 4.9% of American Indians and Native Alaskans were undercounted. That's crazy. So we've been organizing and doing our work. Our Nonprofits Count campaign is built on this idea: what if all of our communities were counted? We've been doing this for about 3 or 4 years now, organizing nonprofits across the state of Michigan, and you can see that on the map there, to get out the count. So how do we mobilize nonprofits across the state that serve a variety of constituents and concerns on the importance of something like census, especially starting in like 2017, 2016? So we started to think about what kind of infrastructure would support this work. And the infrastructure that we built is reflective of this quote that I came across recently. We don't have to actually be the voice of the voiceless. We just have to pass the mic. So that's exactly what our campaign model tries to do. As a nonprofit that serves nonprofits, Michigan M&A doesn't always know specific dynamics of every region or community in Michigan. We know broad trends that affect the sector. We're aware of this. So to really build an infrastructure that might address these issues, we work to identify regional partners, and you can see some of them in the stars on the map there, to serve as a census hub, a place that can help deploy resources and training that meet their community-specific needs. Our hubs were also equipped with data that informed them of where the historically under communities in their areas were, down to the neighborhood, and approach nonprofits serving those communities to build authentic partnerships and redistribute some funding to help these communities enact place-based get out the count efforts. This approach to community engagement is grounded in the idea is that we didn't just want to bring people to the proverbial table and just have a seat there, but we wanted to find a way to support the communities and nonprofits to be in conversations with each other and create their own tables. Our hubs, when they first got started, had numerous listening sessions to better understand the regions that they served, and then sought to create local coalitions that can best inform how to redistribute all the census funding allotted to their communities. Obviously, a lot of the final get out the count strategies that these organizations had in place shifted a lot in the last 6 months, I'm sure you can imagine. We've moved to a lot of virtual convenings, a lot of Facebook Live, a lot of different ways of getting out the message, but also being really creative, meeting community members where they're at, thinking about what are some ways that we can do socially distanced touch points to continue to get out the message that your census matters. Because the work and because our infrastructure is anchored in local organizations, the infrastructure is not mounted and dismounted just because the census is nearing its end. Our hubs are able to continue to engage their networks with ongoing community organizing, mobilizing towards other initiatives that will continue to build social capital and community engagement. Next slide. I probably don't need to tell this group how important voting is, that elected officials know who vote and if your community is turning out well below or above other neighborhoods. And elected officials also know that if you're not turning out to vote, they'll pay less attention to you. We know that indifference begets more indifference. Who turns out to vote has a profound impact on public policy and representation, that their voices get heard, and this matters not only in presidential election years, but all elections. Our voting demographic across the U.S., the eligible voters in the USA, based on census data, FYI, is incredibly diverse. However, this is not represented at all in our electorate. The electorate are the eligible voters who actually vote in the election. In fact, over the last 3 decades, studies have shown that non-white racial groups have actually lost ground as a share of the vote because they're not turning out. It's the norm for 3 in 5 adults, eligible voters, 3 in 5, to vote. In fact, if 2/3 of the voters turned out, that would be considered exceptional, which is wild to me. And I know, voter suppression is real, that there are policies and practices being put in place right now and throughout history that have tried to keep us from voting. What's also real is this idea that permeates throughout a lot of our communities is that our voice and our vote don't matter, that the voting literature might not be in your native tongue, and that poll workers might not care that you showed up or not. So, can you imagine how different our political landscape would be if our electorate, the people who showed up to vote, did, and that it represented all of us, all of our voices? Imagine the world that we could be in right now. Just saying. So, our work in engaging new voters is grounded, again, in the establishment of relationships, meeting communities where they are and engaging them on the basis of their own lived experiences and priorities, just like our census infrastructure. We know that the messenger matters as much as the message, that I can tell you, like I am right now, how important voting is, but it might not resonate until a neighbor or a trusted community member or an elder in your community tells you that your vote matters. So as trusted community leaders, just like with census, we know that nonprofits, all of you, have such an important role to play in ensuring that all of our voices are heard. And that includes encouraging all eligible voters in Michigan to turn out to the polls this November. This year, M&A is partnering with Nonprofit Vote to support organizations across the state that are leading nonpartisan voter engagement activities during the 2020 elections. And again, the last slide that I'll have are different websites that you all can visit to get resources and learn about some of these initiatives. Next slide, please. And like I was saying, voting in non-presidential election years often have voters elect representatives in Congress, state, county, and municipal groups. And these elections are often based on where you live, your district. But because populations are constantly shifting and changing, district boundaries are redrawn every 10 years to reflect the electorate. Surprise, it follows the census data, so important. The 2021-2022 redistricting cycle that's going to follow the close of the 2020 census going to offer our communities in our state a chance to address the systemic inequities and achieve fair distribution of resources and representation for the next decade. Our lines in the state of Michigan are very gerrymandered right now, which means that the drawing of district lines are drawn in a way to dilute a community's fair representation. So we need to make sure that we are participating in this process because redistricting affects political power. It can ensure that communities of color have a fair shot of electing a candidate who reflects and represents our worldview. It determines which parties control our state and local government, who controls Congress, and who speaks for us and who shows up for us. Like I said, gerrymandering is a way to dilute that representation. And that has occurred throughout different redistricting processes across the country over decades. It's not unique to Michigan. And in some ways, it is a modern form of voter suppression and a tool that reinforces institutional racism. So as a push against gerrymandering, in our 2018 election, Michigan voters who showed up, 61% of those voters voted to have an independent redistricting commission redraw all of our district lines for the next decade. That means we have people who are considering where these district lines should be that are everyday citizens like you and I. And that's really, really awesome. The 13 commissioners that are going to be a part of this independent redistricting commission have already been selected and are starting the process right now. And to help sustain momentum and to continue change systems from within, it's important that we as nonprofit leaders continue to encourage our communities to participate in this process. Pretty soon, starting in, I think, 2021 now, there's going to be a lot of public hearings and an opportunity for public input into how these lines should be drawn. We at M&A are in the process of launching a program that will help organize nonprofits, similar to how we just went over for census and voter participation, to understand how to share our input and make sure that your voices are heard in how these district lines should be drawn and how we can show up here. Next slide. Great. Take action. Let's leave you with some to-dos here. I love to-dos and I like crossing things off my list. So here we go. First of all, thank you again for this time this morning to talk about some of the ways that we at M&A are using our civic engagement work to amplify historically marginalized voices. All of our work is grounded in this belief that when we are able to help communities see their neighbors and trusted leaders participate, when we organize nonprofits to work together, we are able to help remove some of these barriers, these systemic issues. We are very much committed to a vision of a just civic life where all individuals and groups feel like they belong to our society. So what can we do now? What can you do now to help make this happen, to help envision this better future? First of all, please, if you haven't already, start integrating, if you can, some language in any collateral that you might have, any messages, outreach that you're doing, to have people fill out the census. The link to fill out the census is right there on your screen, www.2020census.gov. There's tons of language support. There's support to help you hear it. You can call different numbers if you need some assistance there. It's all on that website. Definitely fill it out. It's just 9 questions. And also, if you want to learn more about registering to vote, accessing an absentee ballot, etc., the other website I would direct you to is mynonprofitsvote.org. My is M-I, because we're in Michigan. Please take a second to find out if you're registered, register, get that absentee ballot. Michigan passed an initiative in 2018 as well, so that you don't have to have a reason to ask for an absentee ballot. You can just request one. So please do, if you feel like you don't want to actually show up to the polls, and make a plan to vote. Make a plan to vote. National Volunteer Voter Registration Day is September 22nd, but you can, of course, register before or after if you haven't yet already. And then to stay informed of the continuing redistricting process, please go to redistrictingmichigan.org, and you can see how the commissioners have been seated, where they are in the process, and we'll of course keep you updated on how you can get more involved. Thank you again so much for your time this morning. I'm going to turn it over to Leo now, who will close out our webinar with some legal considerations. And as they indicated at the beginning of the webinar, this is legal guidance and not formal legal advice. Thank you.
This in redistricting. Oh. Thanks, Nellie, for that information on voting, census, accounting, and redistricting. My name is Leo Gadeen. I'm an attorney at Miller Canfield. My topic today is to talk about lobbying and whether nonprofit organizations can lobby and the extent to which they can. Can we go to the next slide? So the question is, are nonprofits, 501c3 organizations allowed to lobby? And we've already seen an example of lobbying in the work that Shalana described to us earlier, where community organizations in the city of Kalamazoo work with the Kalamazoo City Commission to create a housing ordinance. So it indicates that lobbying is allowed. And there's a distinction between lobbying and trying to be involved in campaigning the election of a person for public office, either being opposed to that person or in support of an individual for public office. Under Section 501c3, an organization can't be involved in supporting or opposing a candidate for public office. If you do that, you'll lose your 501c3 exemption. However, you can be involved in lobbying. If you are interested in election, since this is an election year, if you're interested in election year activities and the do's and don'ts of what you can and can't do for as a 501c3 in an election year in terms of electioneering and being involved with candidates, it's my understanding that MCR is going to offer a program dealing with that, and we'll probably have some information available on its website concerning the do's and don'ts with respect to election activities. But let's talk about lobbying, and let's go to the next slide. To qualify for a 501c3 tax exemption under Section 501c3, lobbying is allowed, but you can't have more than a substantial part of your activities being involved in lobbying. And we'll talk about what substantial means a little bit later, but first, the definition of lobbying. It's any attempt to influence legislation either by contacting members of a legislative body or their employees for the purpose of trying to influence legislation, which can be either proposing, supporting, or opposing legislation. It can also include reaching out to the general public and asking them to contact members of the legislature or employees of a legislative branch with the intent of asking them to influence the legislation. And there are two types of lobbying. If we look at the first definition that we spoke about, contacting members of the legislature directly or their employees, that's what we commonly call direct lobbying. If we ask the public to contact legislators or their employees and speak on behalf of legislation, that's generally considered to be grassroots lobbying, because you're actually talking to members of the grassroots and asking them to reach out to try to influence legislation. So let's go to the next slide. So when you lobby, one of the issues that you have to deal with is that it has to relate to a legislative body, and it has to deal with legislation. So a legislative body can include the Congress, the state legislature, and as we saw from Shalona's presentation, a local council or a city commission or a similar legislative body. What constitutes legislation for purposes of Section 501c3 is any action that you ask one of these governmental legislative bodies to take. And one of the important things, and we're going to talk about this a little later in my presentation, is how you may be able to try to obtain civic change by not really involving a legislative body, instead trying to involve the executive branch, the judicial branch, or an administrative body such as a school board, a zoning board, a housing authority, or a police commission. Lobbying does not include attempts to influence the executive or the judicial branch or contact with an administrative body. And we'll see, as I talk later on, that some of the changes, especially some of the issues that we're seeing brought about today with diversity, inclusion, and equity, policing practices, some of those are issues that may be better dealt with without contacting a legislative body, but instead working through, say, police commissions or executive branch. Let's go to the next slide. So we already said that Section 501c3 allows lobbying, but it specifically states that your lobbying can't be a substantial part of your activities. And how do you define what is a substantial part? Well, Section 501c3 and the code and the regulations don't define what substantial means. And instead, we've had to rely on court cases and IRS decisions to try to amplify what that means. And unfortunately, they haven't arrived at a clear definition. Instead, each fact situation has been evaluated on its own merits, and they've looked at a number of factors to determine what constitutes substantial. The factors they've looked at include the time spent by staff and volunteers, the amount spent on lobbying, especially as it relates to your overall expenditures, the type of lobbying you did, the issues that you lobbied on, whether you hired a lobbyist, the form of the communication that you used to for the lobbying. The problem that this creates is that there's really no bright line that an organization can rely on to determine whether or not its activities will qualify as substantial. Some commentators have said that as long as your lobbying is less than 5% of your overall activities, you're probably safe. The problem is trying to measure what the 5% should be 5% of. How do you evaluate 5% of the time spent by volunteers in relation to money spent for lobbying, for example? The uncertainty that's been brought about has made it hard for some organizations to engage in lobbying or to spend enough time lobbying, because they're worried that if they cross the line and their activities become substantial, that this is going to result in them losing their tax exemption, because the penalty for exceeding under Section 501c3, the penalty for exceeding the lobbying limits is if the IRS can revoke your tax exempt status, which is a severe penalty and one that you don't want to lose. Because the fact that substantial has not been defined, and it's created problems with organizations in trying to determine what their criteria are that they should rely on for lobbying, Congress in 1976 passed two statutes, Sections 501H and 4911, which are intended to try to create a more precise way to measure lobbying. And they do this by looking at the expenditures that are made for lobbying in relation to the total expenditures that you make to try to carry out your exempt purposes. And one of the advantages of this is that it's specifically because it focuses on expenditures, it would exclude any time spent by volunteers. So let's go to the next slide. In order to qualify, if you want to have Section 501H applied to your lobbying, it means that you're kind of stepping out of the requirements in Section 501c3, and instead you're adopting a group of a test that's been adopted under Section 501H. It still relies on lobbying being substantial. It can't be substantial. But with the adoption of Section 501H, it's brought with it some regulations that have adopted a number of definitions to try to make things a little clearer. If you wish to have your lobbying measured under Section 501H, you first of all have to file an election to lobby with the IRS. This is a short one-page form, and we put your organization's name, your employer ID number, you check a box, you file it with the IRS. It's good for the year in which you've filed it, and it continues to be good until you revoke it. As I indicated, if you file under Section 501H, you bring with that election a number of definitions, including direct lobbying and grassroots lobbying, which are carryovers from the 501c3. So under direct lobbying, it's still a communication with legislators or employees of a legislative body, but it has to contain two specific elements. Your communication has to refer to specific legislation, and it has to reflect a view on that specific legislation. Grassroots lobbying is similar in the sense that it has to be a communication with the general public, asking them to contact a member of the legislature or an employee of the legislative body, and it has to refer to specific legislation and reflect a view on that legislation. But most importantly, it has to encourage the person who's receiving the communication to take action with respect to the legislation. And with the next slide, that'll talk a little bit about the encouragement that the recipient has to receive. So in order for the individual to be encouraged to take action, the communication has to contain one of four elements. It either has to state the name of the legislator or an employee of the legislative body. It has to give contact information for a legislator or an employee of a legislative body, such as telephone number or address. It has to provide a tear-off postcard or a petition or some other way that the individual who's receiving the communication can communicate back with the legislator. Or it has to specifically identify one or more legislators who are either opposed to the viewpoint of your organization or who are undecided with respect to the legislation that's involved, or it has to give the names of members of a committee or subcommittee that will consider the legislation. There are some organizations that specifically are formulating their communications to the general public so that they don't encourage the recipient to take action. Instead, their communications are formulated in such a way that they're designed to almost outrage the public so that the public will take action without having to be encouraged. And this allows these organizations to publish these messages and not count them as lobbying. Let's go to the next slide. So one of the specific definitions that's adopted under Section 501H is the term specific legislation. As we indicated, in order for direct lobbying or grassroots lobbying to occur, there has to be a referral to specific legislation and it has to reflect a view on specific legislation. And specific legislation is defined as either legislation that's been introduced in the legislature, including in another state, or a proposal that the organization wishes to make but hasn't been reduced to legislation. And this can be a proposal that your organization wants to make, or it can be a proposal that another organization is making. And specific legislation is contrasted with the term plain legislation, which is a term used in Section 501c3. And that's any action by Congress or any state legislature or any local council. So there's a difference between legislation and specific legislation, specifically with respect to what we might call proposals that you wish to have adopted. Let's go to the next slide. Under Section 501H, as we indicated, there are expenditure limits, and your lobbying is measured based on expenditure limits. And the expenditure limits start by looking at how much you've expended to further your organization's exempt purposes. And if you see the chart in front of us, this chart comes right out of the Internal Revenue Code. And there's various, in the left-hand column, it talks about exempt purpose expenditures of various amounts. And let's assume that we're in the first line of an organization that's spent less than $500,000 on exempt purpose expenditures. And first of all, let's try to figure out what is your exempt purpose. Your exempt purpose are the activities that you told the IRS you are going to be engaging in when you filed your application for tax exemption. Let's assume that you're a food pantry and your purpose is to distribute food to needy individuals. Your exempt purpose expenditures would be amounts that you've spent to further that purpose. This could include cost to buy food, cost to distribute it with trucks and employees, cost to stock your warehouse, cost to have your office staff. All of these would be your exempt purpose expenditures because they're all substantially furthering your exempt purpose of providing food to the public. Let's use an example. An organization let's use this food pantry as an example, and let's say it spends $400,000 in a year on its exempt purpose expenditures. Now let's go to the middle column, and we see that it's allowed to spend 20% of that amount for total lobbying. And total lobbying would be direct lobbying and grassroots lobbying. So 20% of the $400,000 of exempt purpose expenditures would be $80,000. You can spend $80,000 in total lobbying expenses. Now, how much of the total lobbying expenses can it spend on grassroots lobbying? And for that, we have to look at the right-hand column, which says that it can spend 25% of the total lobbying amount on grassroots. So your total lobbying amount is $80,000. You can spend 25% of that on grassroots lobbying, which would be $20,000. So out of the $80,000, you could spend $60,000 on direct lobbying, $20,000 on grassroots. If you didn't want to spend all $20,000 on your grassroots lobbying, that could be shifted over to your total lobbying. So for example, you could spend $10,000 on grassroots, $70,000 on total lobbying. Let's go to the next slide. So what happens if you exceed the 501H limits? If you exceed the limits, there's a 25% excise tax on the excess amount. If you exceed the limits in 4 consecutive years, there's a possibility of losing your 501c3 status. I've read about some organizations that are willing to exceed their limits in certain years, particularly maybe years in which they have a large legislative agenda, and they're willing to pay the 25% excise tax, but they make sure that they don't exceed their limits in the other 3 years or other years so that they don't run the risk of losing their 501c3 exemption. Let's go to the next slide. So here's an example that kind of indicates the benefit of using volunteers in terms of trying to determine whether or not lobbying activities are substantial. The example is an organization that contacts legislators and a state legislature to encourage them to vote for legislation that it's being considered, but it uses volunteers to make the call. The organization is involved in direct lobbying because it's contacting members of the legislature and referring to specific legislation and asking them to take action regarding it. Is this lobbying substantial? Well, it's kind of a loaded question, but and really the answer is that we don't have enough information to deal with that. But let's go to the next slide. If the organization has made an election under Section 501H, only the money it's spent on the lobbying would be used to determine whether or not its lobbying is substantial. The efforts of the volunteers would not be taken into the calculation in determining if the lobbying is substantial. So the amount spent for phone calls, the amount spent for the supervisors to monitor the volunteers, and any other expenditures made in connection with the phone calls would be considered as a lobbying expense and would be taken into consideration in determining whether or not you've exceeded the limits for Section 501H. But what if this organization hadn't made a Section 501H election and was still just relying on Section 501c3 to determine whether or not its lobbying was substantial. As we've seen under Section 501c3, the IRS will look at multiple factors to determine whether or not your efforts and your actions are substantial. And this can include the time spent by volunteers as well as the amounts that you spend. So making the election under Section 501H for an organization that specifically is relying on volunteers for much of its activities may make a lot of sense. Let's go to the next slide. So what type of activities don't qualify as lobbying? There are several activities, and three of them are listed on the slide. First is nonpartisan study, analysis, and research. This is any kind of an analysis of either legislation or maybe the subject matter of legislation. And as long as it's a fair analysis, studying all sides of the topic, even if it directly addresses the legislation and reaches a conclusion as to whether or not the legislation should be adopted by the legislature or not passed, it's still considered to be not lobbying, because then hopefully an impartial, nonpartisan study and analysis. The second exception is an examination of broad social, economic, and similar problems. If you're speaking to the legislature about broad problems such as policing, how to regulate policing, and you're talking about perhaps general subjects like no-knock warrants, use of force, whether police should have qualified immunity when they are being challenged for some of the enforcement actions that they've taken. All of those would be broad social and broad social problems that the organization would be discussing. If there's legislation pending on those subjects, you're allowed to mention that, but you can't address the legislature to take action on it. But as long as you're speaking on the subject of the legislation, it's appropriate and it's not considered to be lobbying. Finally, communications with your members. Many nonprofit organizations have large membership bases, and those members are interested in laws that might affect the organization. And the organization keeps these members apprised of this, oftentimes through newsletters, through internet, or whatever. Communications with members, even if it relates to legislation, even if it reflects a view on the legislation, and the organization may have a viewpoint on whether it approves, opposes, or supports the legislation. All that's appropriate to be communicated to the members. However, if you ask your members to take action, either direct action by contacting members of the legislature or by asking your members to contact the general public and have them support or oppose legislation, then the communication is lobbying. So if you don't ask your members to take action, it's not lobbying. If you ask your members to take action, it does qualify as lobbying. Let's go to the next slide. Action organizations. There are some organizations that spend a lot of time lobbying. They can't qualify under Section 501c3. There are other organizations that have as their purpose accomplishing something that can only be done through the passage of legislation. An example might be that you want to have your purpose is to get the legislature to change the laws on qualified immunity for police officers. The only way that that purpose can be accomplished is through legislation. And because it can only be accomplished through legislation, the IRS has deemed you to be an action organization. Action organizations cannot qualify for a 501c3 exemption. If you are an organization that you perceive your purpose as one that can only be accomplished through legislation, you may want to reevaluate your purposes and try to shift them over to being more educational so that you avoid being classified as an action organization. Let's go to the next slide. Today, it seems that the best way to get the attention of legislators and the public is through social protest and public demonstrations. Starting with the death of George Floyd and continuing to today, and as we see in Louisville, where there's been protests every day, people have taken to the streets to express their anger and dissatisfaction with community policing practices. And this has brought other issues to the front on race, social justice, and equality. So the question is, can a public protest that's organized by a 501c3 organization qualify as lobbying? So let's review this, and we'll look at some examples. And in connection with these examples, we're going to have some polling questions for you to try to decide on. So to start with, we go back to our definitions of lobbying that we just looked at, and both direct and indirect, both direct and grassroots lobbying. And direct lobbying, as we see, is a communication with the legislator or an employee that refers to specific legislation and reflects a view on that legislation. So now, with that in mind, let's look at a couple of examples, and let's go to the next slide. So example one on direct lobbying, we're going to assume that an organization contacts its members in the public and asks them to gather in a public street or park to express support for a person who was killed after an interaction with local police, and to also show their outrage at how the community's leaders are handling the investigation of the shooting and the action taken against the officer who committed the act. Protesters arrive with signs stating that Black Lives Matter and similar expressions asking for justice, and also seeking an end to perceived police violence against Black and Hispanic residents. Is this lobbying? I think at this point, we're going to ask you to take a poll. And when the poll results are in, we'll go to the next slide and look at the answers. Are the results in? Okay. The answer is no. And let's go to the next slide, or the majority of you say no. Let's go to the next slide. And my conclusion was that it was not lobbying, because it was not a communication about legislation. It was more a communication about a civic problem dealing with the police and how that would be handled, but there was no legislation that was really focused, that was the focus of the protest, and also there was not clear that the communication was directed at a legislator. It was directed at the public at large. The legislators certainly heard it, but it could just as easily have been directed at the chief of police or prosecutors. Let's go to example number 2 on the next slide. So this is the same facts as example 1, where we've asked the public to come out to the state capitol to protest. But at this time, the state's legislature is considering an ordinance to require police to wear body cams and to also change the requirements for when police can use deadly force. The tax-exempt organization contacts a member of the legislature and states that it plans to have 5,000 people come to the state capitol on a particular day to express their support for the bill. Is this lobbying? Let's do our poll. Okay. When the results are in, post those. Okay. The majority of you say that it is. And let's go to the next slide. And I agree. And the reason is because the organization contacted a legislator about specific legislation and reflected a view on this. However, if the communication had been addressed to the mayor or the chief of police, it'd probably not qualify as lobbying because contact with the executive branch is not lobbying. Let's go to example number 3. So these are similar facts to the ones we've just looked at, where we're asking the general public to come to the state capitol. And in connection with this, your organization directly does not contact the legislator, but announces through the media that it wants the public to gather at the state capitol on a specific day to express support for the bills that the legislature is considering. The public arrives in large numbers, and some have signs that ask the legislators to support the bills. Is this lobbying? At least, is it direct lobbying? And when the answers come in, we'll look at those. Okay, your answers say, the majority say yes. Let's go to the next slide. My thought was that it was probably not lobbying because you didn't directly communicate with the legislature. Instead, your communication was through the media, and your communication was not directly with the legislator. Somebody may challenge this, but at least that was my position on this. That this was not direct lobbying. It was also probably not grassroots lobbying, even though your communication was directed to the general public, because it didn't ask them to specifically communicate with a legislator or one of the 4 methods of taking action. It asked them to come to the state legislature, to the Capitol, but it didn't ask them to specifically contact a specific individual person. Let's go on to the next slide. So we looked at public demonstrations and public protests in the light of whether it can constitute direct lobbying. Now let's look at whether these kinds of actions could qualify as grassroots lobbying. And we've seen the definition of grassroots lobbying, which is a communication with the legislator, a member of the legislative body, or an employee of a legislative body that refers to specific legislation, reflects a view on the legislation, and encourages the recipient of the communication to take action with respect to the legislation. And go to the next slide. And as we've already seen, to encourage the recipient to take action, the communication has to include one of 4 specific messages. So let's go to the next slide. So this is example 4. So a tax-exempt organization announces through the media that it wants the public to gather on the grounds of the state capitol on a specific day to express support for the bills that we've discussed in the earlier examples. These are bills relating to body cams and use of excessive force by police officers. So the public arrives in large numbers, and some have signs that ask the legislature to support the bills. Is this lobbying? Okay, it's kind of close, but a majority of you say yes. Let's go to the next slide. My conclusion was probably not. And why? Because the communication to the Republic, while it refers to a specific bill and reflects a view on it, to me, it's not clear that there was a real call to action in that message. It doesn't ask the communication doesn't ask the public to contact a specific legislator. It doesn't give the address of a legislator. It doesn't provide a means of communicating with the legislator directly. It doesn't indicate if there's a legislator who's opposed to the bill or who's undecided. Instead, the communication just asks a crowd of people to appear at the state capitol to express support for a bill. And I'm not sure, but I would argue that that is probably not lobbying. let's go to the next example, next slide. So the same facts that we just looked at, except in this example, the tax-exempt organization distributes signs to persons who attend the event, and some signs name particular legislators who it knows oppose the bills or who are undecided, and the signs call for them to support the bills. Persons who attend the event are given these signs to carry so they are visible to all. But these are just a few of many signs in the crowd that reflect general messages about passing the bills and general messages about racial equality and that Black Lives Matter. Is this lobbying? Let's go to the polling. Okay. Large majority, you say yes. Some are unclear. Let's look at the next slide. My thoughts is it probably is. Let's go back a slide. My belief was probably yes, that it is lobbying, because you've specifically given out signs to the public that name specific legislators who are opposed to the legislation, who are undecided. The fact that you've already told the public that you support the bill and you've reflected a view on the legislation, when you add the fact that you've encouraged them by naming specific legislators who are opposed to the legislation, that may be enough to qualify as lobbying. Let's go to the next slide. And I believe this may be our last example. So an organization circulates a petition asking individuals and other organizations to contact their state representative and ask her to approve legislation that defunds the police. At the time this petition is circulated, there is no legislation pending to defund the police. Is this lobbying? Let's go to our poll. Okay, it's pretty close, but a majority of you say that it is lobbying. And let's go to the next slide. In my view, is that it's probably not lobbying, because if you've made the election under Section 501, at least if you've made the election under Section 501H, it's probably not lobbying, because it doesn't refer to specific legislation. You're speaking about defunding the police, but the example said that there's no legislation pending to deal with that issue. Since there's no specific legislation that you're dealing with, you're talking about a societal issue, and therefore it shouldn't qualify as lobbying. However, if your organization hasn't made the election under Section 501H, then your action may qualify as lobbying, because you're asking the legislature to take action, and taking action is the definition of lobbying in terms of whether or not it doesn't need to have specific legislation. You're just asking them to take action regarding a matter. So under Section 501c3, if you haven't made the election, it may qualify as lobbying. Let's go to the next slide. We do have another example. So two 501c3 organizations So this is really one where you're using volunteers. So you've got two organizations that organize a protest under, one's made the election under Section 501H, the other has not made the election. And one uses volunteers and the other uses paid staff and volunteers to communicate with the public and to communicate with legislators about the proposal. The question is this lobbying? And I don't think we have a poll for this, but Let's go to the next slide. This is lobbying. It's not that it depends. It really is lobbying. There's an error in my slide, but because you're asking the public to take action with respect to a specific matter, but the issue is whether or not the actions that the organizations are going to take may qualify as substantial. And for the organization that's made the 501H election, if it's using volunteers because they're unpaid, the efforts of the volunteers aren't taken into consideration in determining whether or not the actions of the organizations are going to qualify as substantial for purposes of determining whether or not for lobbying purposes. If you haven't made the Section 501H election, then the organization would take into consideration all factors, including amounts paid to staff, amount of time spent by volunteers, and all other factors, including amounts expended. Let's go to the next example, or the next slide. So the power of protest and the power of public demonstrations is one that is not necessarily limited to just influencing the legislatures. As we've seen from some of the earlier examples and some of the comments I've made earlier, in certain areas of reform, non-legislative bodies may have more influence than a legislature. The district attorney for the city of San Francisco wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times admonishing other prosecutors for not trying to hold police accountable for actions that they've taken where they believe that there's been excessive force used. Oftentimes, there's been a real close relationship between prosecutors and police, where prosecutors are afraid to bring charges against police except in the most severe circumstances. The district attorney for San Francisco says that they need to treat the police the same way they would treat everybody else and look at them equally. In Michigan, prosecutors are elected. They're accountable to the public. They listen to what you say. Likewise, the chief of police. They're not elected, but they do have influence over decisions, such as whether an officer should be fired or suspended or reprimanded. In some cities, mayors also have the power to suspend officers. This is an example. This is in Rochester, New York, where after an individual was accosted by the police, had a hood put over his head, pushed to the street, and then died, the mayor suspended the officers involved. Let's go to the next slide. In Detroit, one of the best examples of an organization that is not a legislative body but carries a substantial amount of influence with respect to policing is the Detroit Board of Police Commissioners. Because it's an administrative body, contact with this organization wouldn't count as lobbying. However, the influence that this organization exerts on the police department is substantial. It's a supervisory and policy-making board. And one of the things that they did recently was to pass some legislation involving use of force, where it's trying to make use of force as a last resort, limiting the ability to shoot at moving vehicles, or shoot either from a moving vehicle or at a moving vehicle or from a moving vehicle, and also trying to affect police ability to deal with people who don't understand police commands. This may require that the police maybe involve social workers and others in terms of trying to get trying to be involved in a situation where there's interaction with the public. So, as you can see, that there are situations, depending on your issue, particularly the one we're talking about here of dealing with the police, where you may be able to achieve a better result by working through the executive branch, such as the mayor, the chief of police, or an administrative body such as a police commission, and you could get better results and faster results than you can if you try to deal with the legislature, which may be more divided. Let's go to the next slide. In some municipalities, in order to hold a public gathering or public demonstration, you need to get a permit. And my research indicated that Detroit requires a permit if you wish to have a public demonstration. And the permit requirements are quite onerous, in my opinion. It's a 7-page application. It requires that you submit proof of insurance, that you have emergency medical care available, and that you have porta-johns available for the crowd. The permit has to be submitted to the city council at least 60 days before the event. And my question is this constitutional? And I'm not absolutely sure, but let me give you some thoughts on this. If you have to submit a permit 60 days before an event, and George Floyd died yesterday, and you wanted to protest today, along with all the other cities in the country and you wanted to join that chorus and speak with one voice with all these people from around the country, but you're not able to do it because you have to wait 60 days for a permit to be issued, and you have to get your porta-johns. Your voice is really not being heard at the moment that it would be its loudest. Under the Constitution, you have the ability to gather peaceably and address your grievances to the government. And if your voice is, if you're not able to speak out immediately after an event, the appearance that you're giving to the public is that, let's say in Detroit, if you have to wait 60 days before you can speak out about George Floyd, the appearance you're giving to the nation may be that you don't care, or that you're not in agreement with the other organizations that are protesting, because you're not protesting with them. When you finally do protest 60 days later, the fact that you're a small group of people out there doing it in the city 60 days after the event may be perceived as too little too late, and that you're really not speaking up in a timely manner. So for all these reasons, I think there's at least some grounds to question whether or not requiring a 60-day time limit for an event, and also requiring substantial other qualifications to hold the event, whether that's constitutional. I think it's at least worth discussing. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, this is the last slide. And if you do engage in lobbying, I just want to let you know that there are two areas of law that you may need to, you may have to register as a lobbyist. Under federal law, you have to register as a lobbyist if you're lobbying members of Congress and the legislative branch, and certain members of the executive branch, including the president and the vice president. And there are financial limits that you only have to register if your lobbying exceeds certain financial limits. The state of Michigan has a similar law called the Michigan Lobby Registration Act, and it defines a lobbyist as any person whose expenditures exceed a certain amount and whose lobbying involves the legislature as well as certain members of the executive branch and administrative bodies. So what you see in the definition of lobbyist in terms of both federal and state law is that it's broader than lobbying for under the Internal Revenue Code, because it can bring in to play individuals who are members of the executive branch and some administrative bodies. That's all for my presentation. I want to thank you for your attendance today. And if you have any questions, please contact me or contact MCR. And if there's anybody who would like a copy of the materials, that's available through MCR as well. I'll now pass it on back to Janai. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to invite all of our panelists to reassemble. Please cut your screens back on and join us. And we have an extra one, yay. All right. Well, thank you for all of the information that you've shared. I do want to do a quick time check and acknowledge that we are running a little bit over on time. We'll ask you to give us maybe 10 more minutes to go through some questions. So to start with, Nellie, you talked about investing in our democracy, and you really lifted up the importance of that. The reality is a lot of folks are skeptical, though, and I think that shows up in some of the numbers that you pointed to, and a lot of folks, even in the nonprofit sector or in philanthropy, the reason why we're here is that we feel like, oh, government hasn't been the pathway through which we could, meet our community's needs. So how do you then engage people and really get them on board with this idea of you need to participate, you need to engage?
I totally get the cynicism for sure, and it is definitely something that you feel a lot, especially when you spend so much time doing this kind of outreach, talking to people, especially, when we're doing a lot of census outreach. I can't tell you how many times I heard, like, who cares if I don't fill out the census? Doesn't matter. They don't care where I live. They don't care how many people are in our house. And I think what the turning point and what we've learned is, having these one-on-one conversations, asking them and hearing about, if the census doesn't matter to you, what does matter to you? What are some of your concerns and your needs for your family, for your household? And then thinking about, here are some ways that our nonprofit and our partners can help you with some of those needs. But then if we were to actually make a fundamental change, if we wanted to rectify the situations that got us here, we need to be more politically engaged. We need to take part in the democracy and actually, try to move the lever a little bit. And we know, some of those metrics that I talked about are definitely a little sobering, but we also know, and it's been really apparent now, that our votes matter, that our voices need to be heard. So I'm hoping that through a lot of our hubs have reported these one-on-one conversations, and it's this relational work of understanding what matters to you as a person, to your family, and then tying it back together.
Thank you. Did anyone else want to chime in on that question? If not, we can move to our next, which is particularly directed at you, Shalana. So what you talked about in terms of your work, just the boldness and I guess uncompromising, unequivocal language that you guys are using as you organize and as you work with communities, that's something that we don't see a lot in philanthropy, to be honest. And I suspect that there might be at least a few people on this call wondering, how do we even start to move in that direction? How will we even get our board and leadership to a space where we could start using that language and thinking in that direction? So you want to talk a little bit about what kind of culture shift needed to take place, if at all, in order to get your leadership on board to move in that direction?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to. And I think it's very true. Just being in a philanthropy conferences, there's some definitely foundations that are doing this work and really kind of leading the sector, and many are not, especially not as many community foundations. There's a lot of private foundations who are more based in equity and justice. But I will say that it was a long journey, and I don't want to overrepresent that we aren't still working on that. But at the same time, yes, I do work at the community foundation. I am able to do this type of work. It really started, I think, from what I understand, I've been at the foundation for about 4 years, and from what I understand, it really started with having an inclusion statement and requiring grantees to assign the inclusion statement, which was at least 10 to 15 years ago. So you can kind of see like the progression from there. The inclusion statement was really written, I believe, around LGBTQ issues, but it was inclusive of other marginalized identities as well. I don't even think they used the term marginalized at that time, so it really was a progression. They started to do leadership trainings. And I know since I've been, the 4 years I've been at the foundation, 4.5 now, they started recruiting folks like me who had a background in equity and community work and justice work. And recruiting folks of color, and those new perspectives really did help shape. And it informed how they recruited new board members when they were needed, for example. So it kind of evolved. I will say the key leaders had to champion it, and our CEO had to continue to leave space, for example, on the board agenda to do this type of learning. So book clubs, discussions, etc. It had to be a part of the operations. And again, you know, we've done tons of training internally for staff, anti-racism training for everyone, 2.5 days. Right at the beginning, affinity groups, we have discussions, book clubs, all kinds of stuff. So we continue to do that and continue to learn through that type of academic and workshop learning, but also through experience and analyzing what we're doing and, you know, how does this fit into all of the different work streams. I think that's the big jump, is going from just learning for the personal understanding to how do you apply this, and then getting those strategies approved. And so that's the space we're in. Obviously, TRHT has been working for over 3 years. So we were approved in that time. And we had, I think, and I believe maybe 2014 or 2015, approved equity and education as the overall organizational grant making strategy. So that predated again, and that has evolved even yet and still. So it was a long journey. I want everybody to know that this type of change doesn't happen overnight, but you have to stick to it, and you can make impacts in community while you're moving on this journey. So definitely don't let, you know, get what you can moving, and you know, reach out to those community resources that can help. But it has to be funded. You have to have funding to do the trainings. You have to have the right staff with the right skills, consultants until you can hire those staff, etc.
Mm-hmm. And so to both of you, I guess just closing out this part, I want you to speak directly to those folks, once again, who are on this call and who are really excited and interested in this idea of, yes, organizing, advocacy. We want to see justice, we want to see equity in practice, but I know this terminology is a cliche by now, but you know, the leadership at my organization is just not woke. I don't know how to wake them up. You know, I'm the program manager, I'm the program associate. What can I do? How do they start agitating in that direction or opening up portals for that conversation?
You want to take that, Nellie, to get started, or I don't know who was that directed to?
It was directed to both you and Nellie.
I have two thoughts about that. Number one is that, you know, this doesn't happen overnight. When you really want to get into anti-racism work, thinking about justice work, it's going to be really uncomfortable for a lot of people, especially a lot of our white allies and our colleagues who might not have had to really examine the different narratives that we have in place that really uphold a lot of the structures that we interact with. So just acknowledging that. And I think for me, where I would start is finding one or two other people, allies, and just to start those conversations, to really think about how to navigate that dialogue in a safe space for everyone involved. Because, you know, it's about building trust. Anti-racism work is about building trust and being relational in a way that is authentic, and that you're not just doing performative work. Like you can just check a box and be like, talk to them, did that book, I'm woke. No, you have to keep doing that and trust that you're going to make mistakes back and forth. her. She is starting to wiggle. I'm going to mute myself.
I love that you said the performative activism. Sometimes I don't know if I'm more frustrated with performative activism or inaction completely. So I would just second that and say that sometimes having a conversation about topics like cultural humility are good starting places because it could really help open up to get to a more anti-racist or more justice-oriented place, but it might start with that. I always, look for that champion within your leadership who maybe back in the day did marches or something like that. Either, there's a lot of, secretly anti-apartheid or civil rights folks still amongst us, and they don't always talk about it. Because it was so ostracized, and we don't always acknowledge how ostracized it really was to be a part of this in the 60s, the civil rights movement, or in the 70s, or anti-apartheid work that happened in the 90s that was really ostracized at that time. It wasn't popular, so a lot of people don't always talk about it, and depending on your environment. So just finding those allies, finding out what is a personal interest. I mean, almost everybody has somebody in their family or circle who has a marginalized identity. So through relationships, you can build that. And I always think about, is there any way to build accountability to grassroots community folks? Build relationship and accountability. Once a relationship starts to get established between folks that are, for example, we have some people who have been previously incarcerated, have felonies, that are now on boards and committees with us. And they're talking to the board chair, who is a retired CEO of a major corporation. And it's like, these people would never have talked to each other, but because they are now talking to each other, it's shifting everybody's perspective. So sometimes it's just even getting folks in the same room and getting them to understand each other can really help go a long way as that first step.
Wow, amazing.
Can I raise a question for Shalana and Nellie and for Janai? I'm on the board of a local food pantry in Kalamazoo, and we've just decided to bring in an outside organization to help us with anti-racism and anti-bias training. I just wanted to get your thoughts on how an organization, people in our audience, how they might go about doing this, and how they might, raise this topic, and what your thoughts are on the effectiveness of this type of training, and for the staff, for the board, and trying to get, find a champion for this who can maybe encourage higher levels in the organization to look at this and explore it.
Yeah, it's great. I'm assuming I may know who you might be working with, but regardless, yes, I do that type of training, support it for our community all the time. I've been through it as a staff. Before this, I was at the Social Justice Center at Kalamazoo College, so we did a lot of this training as well. And I think it's a really important thing to do, not only as a first step, but ongoing. But it really this work is not limited to training. Training just gets you to where you need to be to understand the issues. And so I want folks to know that it can't stop at training, but training is super important. And, sometimes it's about these organizations. There's tons of them out there. There's also tons of just resources out there in general that are online, that are free, webinars, etc. And like tools and principles, for example, that you can access. And Race Forward is a big one. Race Forward used to be the Applied Research Center. They're out there, check them out. There's probably local training organizations in your community as well. Some of them offer public workshops, so sending a key leader to the public workshop to kind of audit it is also a really good thing, because if they have a good experience, they're going to be more bought into training the whole staff or having conversations about it. So that's what I'd say.
All right. So, yeah, Thank you for that question, Leo. I feel like even in these days, a few months out, folks are still in the space of, some of them, wringing their hands like, what can we do? Who do we bring in? But the question is, how do we effectively engage with those people and make sure that the training actually leads in the end to some substantive change? All right, well, I don't want to hog all the time with my questions, although there's more. I do want us to look at some of the questions that came in through the chat. So Kelly, if you want to start lifting some of those up.
Yeah, ironically, the questions that were raised during the chat from the audience members have been answered throughout the presentation. Actually, some were raised early on before content was presented, and I think the discussion that has happened here answered any of the remaining questions that I was going to bring forth. And so I guess if you have a lingering question or you haven't put it in the chat, now's the time to do that. But from the perspective of the production team, it looks like questions have been answered. So yeah, I think just give it a minute to double check, but otherwise I wouldn't bring forth any more questions, and don't know if any of the presenters or you, Janae, as the moderator, have any other closing thoughts or things that you want the audience members to take away.
I'm wondering if we do want to do a round of closing thoughts. Oh, I've been made the presenter. I'm not sure what that means. Yeah, so I'm happy to say something, but I also want to give the floor to you, ladies and gentlemen, if you have anything you want to share, rapid fire. No? All right, well, we have just spent the last little bit of time hearing some different and very valuable perspectives on how we as nonprofits and philanthropy leaders can be about the work of social change that looks like advocacy, that looks like civic engagement, and that definitely looks like understanding the laws related to how we can spend our time, you know, how we have to account for our activities, because at the end of the day, the 501c3 status is a privilege and we don't want to lose it. If you have questions, follow-up questions for the folks on this panel, their email addresses have been shared in the chat, and I'm sure that'll be shared out in any kind of follow-up email. I do just want to reemphasize that we appreciate your time, and especially to those of you who've been able to stay a little later. Please stay tuned or join us again next week for our final installation of this series. And with that, we wish you a good day. Thank you, panelists, once again.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. This concludes the webinar.
Hey y'all, that was such a good conversation. I felt so lucky to be in the background of that.
Thank you. Is there a waiting room or a lobby or something?
Yeah, so after our webinars, I go through and I make everyone a presenter. And then all of the attendees, if they want to stick around and chat more, they're welcome to. Sometimes people show up and sometimes not, and sometimes people have other things to do. But I always appreciate the part after a presentation where everybody just kind of walks up and chats with each other. Yeah, so, and also, Jelana, nice to see you again. I feel like we're constantly in these same spaces.
Yeah, I was like, oh, now that I see your face, I was like, oh, I know that face. I wasn't really thinking about it when I just saw your name pop up, but yeah, it's really awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, Thomas is in the house here, so I loved it. I'm really glad because I left and came back, and I saw Leo. I saw some of your examples, and I've been through those workshops before. Obviously, I had to know like Kellogg doesn't allow lobbying and for their funding. If you're spending their money, so we had to make sure that we were spending other funding sources and stuff. But it was just a really good reminder because it really is complicated, and sometimes it's just a matter of language change. And so yeah, fun stuff.
Yeah, it was a great session. Oh, hey, Nellie. Yeah, and now nobody else is on with us, so we can actually talk. I'm like figuring once I actually said we can't talk afterwards. Thank you. This was unbelievable. I mean, unbelievable. The content, the way that it flowed, being able to just talk about the different layers and have the examples, Shalana and Nellie, but certainly Leo bringing in some just real-time examples of helping people really differentiate. This is an issue that we have heard a lot from the field and our nonprofit members on just wanting to better understand what they can do differently than what they maybe have done in the past by wanting to become more engaged on several levels. And I think this presentation hit it out of the park, and the feedback from the participants and some of the things in the chat have reiterated that. So thank you so much. This was fantastic.
And I'm heading out, but I'll see y'all later. And thanks so much.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. Yeah, I hope you guys have a great rest of the afternoon.
Excuse me.
It's always fun to see a little baby face on the screen. I know, I love it. I know probably parents are like, oh my God, but I'm like, oh, there's a baby with us. Okay.
Thank you so much for saying that.
I don't have kids at home, so I get to like enjoy this, but yeah. And hopefully she's probably just soaking it all in. So,
Yeah.
All right, you all.
All my calls, but it's good seeing you.
Yep. Bye.
I will check out too. Thank you very much.
Oh, there's somebody.
Oh, I thought you were leaving.
I was, but then I saw somebody, and I wonder if there was more people that were gonna join.
Hi, Shmuel.
Hey, sorry about co-opting you guys.
No, it's great. I think there's a few other people that are actually on as well that have not signed off. So
Okay.
hopefully they can hear or feel comfortable showing their cameras.
Okay. Well, we are signing off. Say hi.
Hi. Hey.
Thanks, Shmuel.
All right. Yep, I'm gonna.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye.
Will we get any of the feedback? Will that come to us in terms of comments and things? Okay.
Yep, we can definitely send that to you post the session. Yep.
Okay, great. Well, I'll sign off. I hope I didn't speak too long. I thought I went longer than I probably thought I did, but I had to cover it. So.
Yep. Nope. Lots of great content for sure.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Kelly. I enjoyed the opportunity to work with you and MCR on this, and hope we can do it again.
Yep. We greatly appreciate it. Thanks, Leo.
Thank you. Bye-bye.